This wasn't the future we fought for, but it's the one we have. We must stand together now, or fall alone.
The chains screamed before the humans did. That was the first thing that unsettled Overseer Vren Kal, commander of the mining colony, HFY, buried 3 kilometers under the frozen crust of a moon that had no name worth remembering. Metal restraints, forged from compressed neutronium alloy, designed to hold beings 10 times stronger than any known species in the galaxy. And they were bending. Not breaking. Not yet. Bending. Vren stood behind reinforced glass, watching 60 human laborers hauling ore carts through a tunnel lit by dying orange lamps. Their skin was gray with dust. Their eyes were hollow. Every one of them looked broken, exhausted, defeated. And yet the restraint locked around the wrist of the tallest one. A scarred human the guard simply called 7-4 had cracked down the middle. "Replace it," Vren ordered. "Sir," said his aide, a thin, nervous Threll named Peak. "That's the 4th one this cycle. The alloy doesn't fail. It's never failed. Not on the Threll, not on the Asuran, not on anyone." He shuffled the data slate in his claws, refusing to meet Vren's eyes, the way he always did when the numbers frightened him more than the punishment for reporting them would. "I checked twice. The specs haven't changed. The manufacturing batch is identical to every shipment we've received since the colony opened." "Then the fault isn't in the metal." "No, sir." PP's voice dropped. "I don't think it is." Vren's 4 eyes narrowed. "Then why," he said quietly, "is it failing on the weakest species we have ever enslaved?" Neither of them had an answer. Neither of them wanted one. Below them, through the reinforced glass, the tunnel stretched into darkness lit only by strings of failing lamps. Ore carts rattled over uneven rails. Steam vented from cracked pipes curling around ankles like something alive. The air down there was thick with rock dust and the metallic tang of blood that never quite washed out of the stone. Vren had walked 100 labor colonies across his career. He had seen the Asuran break under gravity chains within a year. He had seen the Ketheri lose their will within months, their bioluminescent skin dimming until they simply stopped moving, stopped eating, stopped existing. Humans did neither. 11 years and they still worked. 11 years and they still whispered to each other in the dark. 11 years and somehow, impossibly, they still looked at their captors with something that was not quite hatred and not quite fear. Something Vren had never learned to name because no other species had ever shown it to him. "Pull the maintenance logs on every restraint unit," he told Peep. "Cross-reference with labor assignments. I want to know if this is isolated to one individual or if it's spreading." Pe hesitated. "Sir, if it is spreading, what do we do?" Vren didn't answer immediately. He watched 7-4 disappear around a bend in the tunnel, shoulders squared despite the weight of the cart behind him, despite 11 years of captivity pressing down on his spine. "We find out what we actually captured," Vren said finally, "before it finds out for itself." The humans had been taken 11 years ago, in the era the galaxy called the Second Reckoning, when the Threll Dominion swept through the outer spiral arm, cataloging every species too primitive to resist. Humanity had barely reached its neighboring star systems. No shields, no weapons that could scratch a Threll warship's hull, no allies. Conquest had taken 4 days. The Dominion's official record called it the easiest annexation in 1,000 years. Historians mocked humanity in textbooks distributed across 900 worlds. Children on Threll colonies learned about the frail, short-lived species that surrendered almost without a fight. Weak, fragile, unremarkable. That was the story. That was the lie. The truth was messier, buried under layers of military pride that no Threll historian had ever bothered to question. When the Dominion fleet arrived above Earth, humanity had no shields capable of stopping a single warship's opening volley. Cities fell in hours. Orbital defense platforms, humanity's proudest achievements, built over half a century of desperate innovation, were reduced to drifting scrap within a single afternoon. By any measure the Dominion understood it was a rout. But rout was the wrong word for what actually happened on the ground. Human resistance fighters, armed with weapons a Threll soldier would have laughed at, held mountain passes for 6 days against orbital bombardment. Civilian volunteers, untrained and unarmored, threw themselves at Dominion dropships with nothing but desperation and a refusal to run. None of it changed the outcome. None of it slowed the invasion by more than a week, but it was noted, quietly, in a single line, buried in a field commander's report that was never widely circulated. Subject species demonstrates unusual persistence relative to combat capability. Recommend further study. No one studied it. The Dominion had a galaxy to catalog, and humanity was simply one more entry in a very long list of species too primitive to matter. They were wrong to stop looking. They just didn't know it yet. 7-4's real name was Marcus Wren. He had not spoken it aloud in 6 years. Names were dangerous here. Names made you a person, and persons could be broken in ways. Numbers could not. He pushed the ore cart forward, muscles burning, lungs aching in the thin, recycled air. Beside him, a woman named Iris, designation 12-2, matched his pace without a word. They had an unspoken rhythm now, built from years of shared suffering. When the guards weren't looking, her fingers would brush his arm. A small thing. A human thing. It meant, "I'm still here." "Are you?" He always answered the same way. A single tap. Yes. Today, something was different. Today, the restraint on his wrist had cracked. He'd felt it happen 3 shifts ago. A strange heat blooming under his skin, like something ancient waking from a long sleep. He didn't understand it. He only knew that when it happened, the guards became nervous, and nervous guards were dangerous guards. "Report to processing," barked a Threll overseer, his voice amplified through a translator collar. 7-4, now. Marcus set down the cart. Iris's fingers brushed his arm. "Be careful." He didn't answer this time. He didn't know if he could promise that. He'd had a daughter once. 6 years old when the Dominion ships broke atmosphere over the Pacific coastline. He remembered carrying her down into a shelter that turned out to be no shelter at all, just a concrete box that the orbital strikes cracked open like an egg 3 hours later. He remembered the silence afterward. He remembered not being able to find her in the rubble, and then finding her and wishing for one terrible, guilty moment that he hadn't. He did not talk about her. Not even to Iris, who had lost a brother the same week, in a different city, in a different kind of ruin. Grief on Earth after the invasion had become a shared, silent language. Something every survivor carried, and no one needed explained. What the Dominion never understood, what their sensors could never quite measure, was that grief like that didn't hollow a person out. It compressed them. Like coal under a mountain, waiting long enough to become something harder than the thing that crushed it. Marcus walked toward processing with that same old ache behind his ribs, and underneath it, faint but growing. Something new, a heat in his blood he didn't have a name for yet, but that felt, strangely, like waking up. Wren Kale met the human personally, which itself was unusual. Overseers did not typically address labor units, but something about this particular anomaly demanded his attention. The examination chamber was cold, sterile, lined with sensors. Marcus stood in the center, restraints fresh, doubled, humming with warning lights that meant they were drawing maximum containment power. "You broke Dominion-grade neutronium," Wren said, studying a data slate. "Do you understand how impossible that is?" Marcus said nothing. "Answer me." "I didn't break anything," Marcus said. His voice was rough from disuse. "I just got tired of it holding." Wren's eyes flickered, an involuntary tell of Threll confusion. "That doesn't make sense. Maybe you don't understand humans as well as you think." The words hung in the sterile air like a struck match near dry fuel. Wren stepped closer, studying the human's face. Marcus did not flinch, did not look away, did not show the fear the Threll had come to expect from every subjugated species in their long, brutal history of conquest. "You should be afraid of me," Wren said. "I used to be," Marcus answered. "A long time ago." "What changed?" Marcus's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Grief, memory, an old wound reopening. "You people took my daughter's future," he said quietly. "There's nothing left in me that's afraid of anything after that." Wren studied him for a long moment, 4 eyes cycling through spectrums no human retina could perceive. reading heat patterns, muscle tension, the subtle chemical signature of a body under stress. Every instrument told him the same thing: the human was not lying, and the human was not afraid. "Do you know what we do?" Vren said slowly. "To labor units who become difficult. I imagine it's not pleasant." "It is not. I've buried people who went through it," Marcus said. "I know exactly what it looks like. And still you sit here telling me I don't understand your species, as if that changes anything." Marcus leaned forward as far as the restraints allowed. "It changes everything. You spent 11 years cataloging us like livestock, measuring how much weight we can carry, how many hours we can work before we collapse, how little food keeps us moving. You never once asked what happens to a person who survives all of that and keeps their mind intact anyway. And what does happen?" For the first time, something like a smile crossed Marcus's face. Thin, tired, but real. "You're about to find out." For the first time in 11 years of conquest, Vren Kal felt something he did not have a word for. It might have been doubt. That night in the lower barracks, Iris found Marcus staring at the ceiling, his cracked restraint glowing faintly under the emergency lights. "They're going to investigate," she whispered. "The others are talking. Some of the workers, their bands are weakening too." Marcus sat up slowly. "How many?" "At least a dozen, maybe more. It's spreading, Marcus, whatever this is." He rubbed the mark on his wrist where the metal had bent. "You remember what our grandparents used to say?" he asked. "About the collapse?" Iris's expression darkened. "That's a bedtime story. A myth adults tell to make suffering feel meaningful." "Is it?" "Marcus, the long winter was 200 years before either of us were born. Whatever happened to people back then, it's not going to explain metal bending under my hands in a mining tunnel." "My grandmother used to say the ones who lived through it came back different," Marcus said. "Not just tougher, changed. She said doctors couldn't explain how fast the wounds closed, how the survivors could go days without food or water, in conditions that should have killed them twice over. She said it skipped a generation, sometimes two, waited for the right kind of suffering to wake it up again." "That's superstition." "Maybe." Marcus turned his wrist over, studying the faint silver line where the restraint had split. "Or maybe superstition is just science that hasn't found its language yet." Iris was quiet for a long moment, listening to the distant hum of the mining machinery 2 levels below, the sound that never stopped, day or night, the sound that had become the closest thing to a heartbeat this moon had ever had. "If it's true," she said finally, "if this is really happening to more of us, what do we do with it?" Marcus looked at his hands, at the strength humming just beneath the surface of skin that had been beaten, starved, and worked to the edge of collapse for over a decade. "We decide who we want to be," he said, "before they decide it for us." She didn't answer. Because deep down, she wasn't sure anymore either. 200 years before the Threll Dominion ever noticed humanity, Earth's scientists made a discovery that should have ended the species entirely. A cascading solar event, later called the Long Winter, stripped away nearly all of Earth's atmosphere-shielding satellites, exposing billions of people to radiation levels that should have caused extinction within a decade. It didn't. Humanity adapted, not through technology, not through evacuation, through something buried far deeper: cellular resilience forged over hundreds of thousands of years of surviving ice ages, plagues, famines, and near-extinction events that had shaped human DNA into something stranger than anyone, even humans, fully understood. The survivors of the Long Winter didn't just endure radiation. Their bodies began rewriting damaged cells at a molecular level, a trait dormant in human genetics for millennia, only activated under catastrophic biological stress. It was never announced to the galaxy. There was no galaxy to announce it to. Humanity was still alone, still isolated on one fragile blue world, unaware that the thing which almost destroyed them had also made them something new. The scientists who discovered it called it the threshold response, a genetic failsafe buried so deep in human DNA that it required near-total systemic collapse to trigger. It was not always fatal to activate. It was not always survivable to ignore. Populations that endured the long winter's radiation without the response simply died. Populations that carried it lived, and in living, passed something forward that no peacetime generation would ever need. For 200 years, humanity forgot. There was no war brutal enough, no famine severe enough, no catastrophe close to the scale of the long winter to trigger the response again. Children were born healthy. Cities were rebuilt. The trait slept in human blood like a seed buried too deep for any ordinary season to reach it. It took a different kind of catastrophe to wake it. Not radiation, not a dying sun. 11 years of chains, starvation rations, and a captivity engineered specifically to break the human spirit without technically killing the human body. A slow, calculated, relentless pressure that the Threll believed was the safest possible way to extract labor from a fragile species. They had, without realizing it, built the exact conditions the response was designed to answer. Something no other species carried. Something no restraint in the galaxy was designed to hold. Wren requested emergency access to the Dominion archives, records classified under military authority, detailing humanity's brief and unremarkable war of conquest. He expected confirmation of weakness. He found something else entirely. Buried in outdated sensor logs from the invasion, barely noted by the annexation fleet, was a single medical anomaly. Human biological readings during the 4-day war showed cellular repair rates climbing exponentially under combat stress, a pattern the Threll fleet doctors dismissed as sensor error. They had not been fighting a weak species. They had been fighting a species that hadn't yet learned what it was capable of. Wren stared at the data until his eyes ached. "Pick," he said finally. "Pull every human medical file since the occupation began, every injury, every recovery time." "Sir, that's 11 years of records. Now." It took PPE 19 hours to compile them. Wren did not sleep during any of it. He sat in his quarters, the starred charts of the outer spiral arm glowing faintly on the far wall, and watched decade-old medical scans scroll past in silence. A worker crushed under a collapsed support beam, both legs shattered, walking again in 11 days. A worker whipped for insubordination, back laid open to the bone scar tissue fully formed within a week, stronger than the skin around it. A worker starved for 6 days as punishment for a work stoppage, body weight down to a number that should have meant organ failure, found 2 days later hauling ore at full capacity, as if nothing had happened at all. Individually, each file was an anomaly, easily dismissed, easily blamed on faulty sensors or Threll unfamiliarity with human physiology. Wren had seen anomalies before. Every species produced outliers, but laid side by side across 11 years, across 60 different workers, across every type of trauma the Dominion's cruelty had devised. The pattern was unmistakable. It was not random. It was not rare. It was universal, and it was accelerating. The worst-treated humans were healing fastest. The ones who had suffered longest were becoming, in slow and terrifying increments, something the Dominion's own weapons had never been designed to stop. Wren thought of every order he had personally signed, every ration cut, every punishment detail, every restraint tightened just a fraction more than necessary to remind a labor unit of its place. He had spent 11 years without knowing it, sharpening the very thing meant to keep him safe. What they found changed everything. Humans assigned to the most brutal labor details, the ones who suffered the worst injuries, the deepest wounds, the most punishing conditions, were not merely surviving. They were adapting. Broken bones healed faster than medical science should allow. Deep lacerations closed in days instead of weeks. And in the most severely traumatized subjects, those who had endured years of suffering without breaking, something extraordinary was happening at a cellular level. Their bodies were beginning to exceed their original biological limits. Stronger, faster, more resilient with every injury survived. The Threll had believed they were harvesting a weak, easily controlled labor force. They had actually been years, unknowingly, awakening the most dangerous trait in human evolutionary history, pushed to its absolute threshold by the very cruelty meant to keep it dormant forever. By the time Wren finished cross-referencing the data, the maintenance logs told a story of their own. 14 restraints had failed in the past month alone, nearly triple the rate from the month before. Guard reports, once dismissed as exaggeration or fatigue, now painted a clearer picture. Humans lifting ore carts that should have required hydraulic assistance. Humans working double shifts without the exhaustion that had once made them predictable, manageable, safe to underestimate. One guard's report, filed only 2 days earlier and nearly buried under routine paperwork, described a human worker catching a support beam that had sheared loose from the ceiling, catching it with his bare hands, holding it long enough for 3 other workers to escape, before setting it down as if it weighed nothing at all. The guard had written it off as adrenaline. Freak strength born of a single desperate moment. It was not a single moment. It was a pattern, and patterns did not lie, even when everyone around them insisted on believing otherwise. Ren Kale sat in silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like the crushing gravity of a collapsing star. "We didn't conquer the weakest species in the galaxy," he whispered. "We conquered the one species designed to survive anything we could do to it." The rebellion did not begin with weapons. It began with a whisper, passed hand to hand, cell to cell, through 11 years of shared suffering. Tonight, Marcus Wren stood at the center of the lower barracks as workers gathered in the dark, restraints humming, cracks spreading across metal built to be unbreakable. "They think we're broken," he said quietly. "They think 11 years turned us into nothing. But every wound they gave us, every year they thought was breaking us down." He held up his wrist. The restraint split clean in half, falling to the floor with a sound like a closing door, was building something instead. Iris stepped beside him, her own restraint fracturing as she flexed her fingers. "They don't know what we survived to become," she said. Around them, dozens of humans, scarred, exhausted, and now impossibly strong, rose to their feet as one. Above them, in the station's central command ring, a young Threll guard named Dasil watched the barrack security feed flicker and die, camera after camera going dark in a pattern that moved too fast to be equipment failure. "Sir," he stammered into his comm, "we're losing the lower levels." "Lock every blast door," came the reply. "Full containment protocol. No one leaves that sector." Dasil's claws hovered over the controls. The blast doors on HFY were rated to withstand a direct hull breach, engineered to hold against explosive decompression, against fire, against anything the Dominion's own military might throw at them in a worst-case scenario. They had never been rated against bare hands. The first door held for 4 seconds, before the seam along its center began to glow white-hot, not from any weapon, but from raw, sustained pressure applied by something on the other side that refused to stop pushing. Dasil had spent 3 years guarding this colony. He had watched humans stumble through their shifts half-starved, half-broken, easy to underestimate because they made themselves easy to underestimate. He understood, in the 4 seconds it took that door to fail, that this had never been the truth of them. It had only ever been the mask they wore to survive. The door came apart in a shower of sparks, and Dasil did not run. He simply stood very still, and hoped that whatever walked through would remember he had never once raised a hand against them. What walked through was Marcus Wren, flanked by Iris and a dozen others, their broken restraints still hanging loose from scarred wrists. Dasil braced for the end, eyes closed, claws trembling against the console. It never came. "Sit down," Marcus said quietly. "Cam the other guards. Tell them to stand down and no one gets hurt. That includes you." Dasil opened his eyes, uncertain he had heard correctly. "You're not going to—" "We've had enough people decide our lives for us," Marcus said. "We're not interested in becoming the kind of people who do that to someone else. Even you." Behind him, one of the freed workers, a broad-shouldered woman named Priya, whose back still carried scars from a whipping 3 years prior, studied Dasil for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Then she stepped past him without a word, without violence, and moved toward the next corridor. Dasil watched them go, 60 humans moving through the station like a slow, unstoppable tide that somehow left every guard in its path breathing. He would spend the rest of his life trying to explain that restraint to Threll officers who would never quite believe him. Ren Kale reached the lower barracks 11 minutes too late. He found broken restraints scattered across the floor like shattered eggshells, guard stations empty, security doors torn from their hinges, not by explosives, not by weapons, but by hands. Human hands. He found Marcus Wren standing at the center of it all, calm, steady, surrounded by humans who could have killed every Threll guard on the station and hadn't. That single fact stopped Wren in the doorway. "You could have slaughtered us," he said. "We could have," Marcus agreed. "We didn't." "Why?" Marcus looked at him with eyes that held 11 years of grief, and something else now, something that looked almost like mercy. "Because becoming what you made us doesn't mean becoming what you are." Wren had commanded fleets. He had crushed uprisings on a dozen worlds. He had never, in 300 years of service, heard words like that from a captive species. Behind Marcus, dozens of humans stood in silence, watching their commander with a stillness that unsettled Wren more than any weapon could have. He understood, looking at them, that he was not standing in the aftermath of a riot. He was standing in the presence of a choice. One that could have ended very differently, and hadn't. "You understand what happens now," Wren said carefully. "The Council will hear about this. They will send fleets, entire battle groups, if they believe your species is a threat to Dominion stability." "Then tell them the truth first," Marcus said. "Tell them what actually happened here before their fear tells a different story. And if they don't believe me, then we'll still be exactly what we've always been." Marcus's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something ancient. A species that endures. Whether anyone believes it or not. Wren was silent for a long moment. Behind his 4 eyes, something that had governed 3 centuries of conquest. Certainty, hierarchy, the comfortable order of who ruled and who obeyed, was quietly rearranging itself into something he did not yet have a framework for. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Passage," Marcus said. "For every human on this station, and a message sent to the Dominion Council." "What message?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Tell them what you told your aide. Tell them what the reports show. Tell them exactly what they created." The message reached the Dominion Council 3 days later, delivered not by force, not by fleet, but by Wren Kaol himself, standing before the galaxy's most powerful military authority with data he could not deny. "We enslaved a species," he said, "believing weakness made them safe to exploit. We were wrong. Humanity's true strength was never physical. It was psychological, emotional. Biological resilience forged from near extinction, refined across 10,000 generations of catastrophe." The council chamber fell silent. "They endured 11 years of captivity," Wren continued. "With a power to end every guard who oppressed them, they chose restraint instead. Not because they were incapable of violence." He paused. "Because they understood something about strength that we never did." A senior counselor, an ancient Threll named Osrith, who had overseen the annexation of 40 worlds, rose from his seat. "You are asking this council to believe," he said, voice thick with disbelief, "that a species we conquered in 4 days somehow poses a threat greater than any fleet in Dominion history." "I am asking this council to consider," Wren replied evenly, "that we never actually conquered them. We interrupted them. There is a difference, and it is the only thing standing between us and a war we cannot win." "Then destroy them," Osrith said flatly, "before that difference matters. Destroy 62 individuals who chose not to kill every guard on that station when they had every reason and every capability to do so." Wren shook his head slowly. "Counselor, I have spent 300 years learning how species respond to power. I have never seen restraint like theirs. If we answer it with slaughter, we will not be neutralizing a threat. We will be teaching an entire species exactly what kind of enemy we intend to be." The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, fear, anger, disbelief, all colliding at once. Wren let it wash over him without responding, because he already knew the argument that would ultimately win. Fear always won in rooms like this. He simply hoped it would win in the right direction. The humans were not freed through mercy. They were freed through fear, a calculated unanimous Dominion vote born from the terrifying realization that an entire species with exponential physical adaptation, forged through generations of suffering and quietly perfected under 11 years of brutal captivity, might one day decide restraint was no longer necessary. But it was not fear alone that ended humanity's chains. It was respect. However reluctant, however late. The vote had not been unanimous. Osrith and 11 other counselors had argued until the final hour for a preemptive strike, for a fleet large enough to erase the anomaly before it could spread beyond a single mining colony. What stopped them, in the end, was not compassion. It was a single question Vren placed before the chamber, one no strategist could answer with confidence. If a species can survive 11 years of everything we are capable of doing to them and still choose not to become us, what exactly do we believe a war against them will accomplish? No one had a good answer, and in the absence of a good answer, the council chose the safer path: release, observation, and a quiet, unspoken hope that humanity would remain as merciful in freedom as they had been in chains. The transport ship Solace was not built for comfort. It was an old Dominion supply vessel, stripped of weapons and repurposed in less than a week, its corridors still smelling faintly of the ore it used to carry. To the 62 humans who boarded it, it might as well have been a palace. Marcus walked the length of the cargo bay slowly, running his hand along the cold metal walls, half expecting them to be a dream he would wake from back in the tunnels. Around him, humans who had not seen open sky in over a decade pressed their faces to the narrow viewports, watching starlight for the first time without a guard shadow standing between them and it. A young man named Toby, no older than 19, had been born on HFY and had never once seen his ancestral world. He stood transfixed at the viewport, watching the black scroll past. "Is it always like this?" he asked no one in particular. "Just stars. Forever." "Not forever," Marcus said, stepping beside him. "Just far enough that it feels that way." "What's it like? Earth?" Marcus considered the question for a long moment, memories rising unbidden. A house that no longer existed, a daughter who no longer existed, a version of himself that had also, in some ways, stopped existing the day the ships arrived. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "But I know it's ours. That has to be enough to start with." Toby nodded slowly, and for the first time since his birth in captivity, allowed himself to imagine a horizon that wasn't made of tunnel walls. Marcus Wren stood at the airlock of the transport ship Solace, watching HFY shrink behind them into the black. Iris stood beside him, her hand resting on the same wrist that once bore a broken restraint. "Do you think they'll remember what we did?" she asked. "Or just what we could have done?" Marcus considered the question for a long moment. "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe that's the point." Ren Kael filed his final report 6 months later, standing before a room of Threll historians preparing new records for distribution across 900 worlds. The same worlds that had once mocked humanity's swift, humiliating defeat. He had requested this assignment himself, against the advice of nearly every colleague he had. There was no honor in it, no promotion waiting at the end. Only the quiet, stubborn need to make sure that the next generation of Threll children did not grow up believing the same comfortable lie he once had. "Correct the archives," he told them. "Humanity did not surrender because they were weak." One of the historians, a younger Threll who had never served on a labor colony, frowned at the data slate in her hands. "Overseer Kael, with respect, our records show a 4-day war with negligible resistance. Casualty ratios of nearly 1,000 to 1 in our favor. By every measurable standard we chose to use," Vren interrupted, not unkindly. "We measured hull integrity, weapon yield, territory secured. We never once measured what a species is willing to endure rather than become something it doesn't recognize. That measurement doesn't show up on a battlefield. It shows up 11 years later in a mining tunnel when chains start bending for no reason. Your instruments can explain." He paused, remembering the calm, unbreakable eyes of a man named Marcus Wren. "They surrendered because they hadn't yet discovered what 11 years of suffering would awaken. We didn't defeat humanity in 4 days." He looked toward the star charts, toward the distant, unremarkable blue world that had once been dismissed as insignificant. We simply arrived before they knew what they were. The historians said nothing. That silence, Vren thought, was its own kind of answer. The sound of an empire quietly reckoning with 300 years of certainty that had turned out to be nothing more than an unfinished chapter. Somewhere far across the galaxy, on a small ship drifting toward a home world it hadn't seen in over a decade, 62 humans slept peacefully for the first time in 11 years. No longer chained, no longer hidden, no longer misunderstood. Marcus Wren dreamed that night, for the first time in years, of a shoreline instead of a tunnel, of sunlight instead of failing lamps. Somewhere in the dream, a small girl ran ahead of him across warm sand, laughing forever, 6 years old, forever just out of reach, and for once, the dream did not feel like grief. It felt like a promise. Iris slept beside him, her hand still resting on the wrist that had once worn a restraint built to hold something the galaxy never understood and never would have if it hadn't been forced to look closely enough to see the truth. And across 1,000 worlds that had once called humanity primitive, a single sentence began spreading through Dominion archives like wildfire. Copied from Vren Kaal's own report, quoted in briefing rooms, whispered by soldiers who would never admit how much it unsettled them. Never mistake a species' silence for weakness. Some of them are simply waiting to remember what they survived to become. Far ahead of the solace, past the reach of any star chart the Dominion had ever drawn, a small blue world turned slowly in the dark, waiting 11 years to welcome its children home, never knowing that the ones returning were no longer the same people it had lost. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. They were something the galaxy would never forget again.